So Batman v Superman currently has a lower score on Rotten Tomatoes than the Daredevil movie from 2003, a fact which I'm sure is keeping Ben Affleck up at night, but is it accurate? Is Batman v Superman actually a worse movie than Daredevil? Well, I went back and watched the Daredevil director's cut to try and answer that very question. I present to you Batman v Superman v Daredevil 2003. So in this video we're going to be comparing characters, action sequences, plot developments, all in an effort to decide which is the best comic book adaptation. Now remember, I'm comparing Batman v Superman to the Daredevil director's cut, not the theatrical cut. They're very different films. Now, for part 1. Daredevil v Batman. I'm only going to be comparing Daredevil to Batman for 3 reasons. Number 1, both are played by Ben Affleck in the movies. Number 2, Daredevil is more similar to Batman than he is to Superman. And number 3, I kind of feel like Batman v Superman is more Batman's film than it is Superman's film. Now let's start at the beginning with character origins. Daredevil's origins aren't explained super well. I think that his radar vision and sense powers are quite well defined and quite well portrayed on screen very visually. However, the fact that in this movie he basically trains himself in combat seems very far-fetched and hard to believe, especially as we know this wasn't the case in the comic books. Additionally, what this origin is also not able to explain is how Daredevil is able to literally leap over buildings. At the end of his fight with Bullseye, he leaps from the top of a church onto the next tall building over a wide road, and it's just like Daredevil's powers are just the sense stuff, you know, just the radar vision and the sense powers, the hearing, the smell. Why is he able to leap over buildings all of a sudden? It's very odd. It's something that Elektra also does to some degree as well, and it's just like, these are just people, you know? They haven't been biologically enhanced in the way that Captain America has, so why they're doing all these impossible feats is kind of beyond me, and it's never explained or even referenced. I guess this is supposed to kind of be normal behaviour for a regular human being in the Daredevil universe. There's also a terrible alley fight sequence involving Matt Murdock and a group of bullies. It involves someone getting smacked in the face super fast with a white cane. It's terribly edited, terribly choreographed. There's no defending that scene. However, I do believe that the saving grace of the Daredevil origin in this movie is the death of Matt Murdock's dad, which I think was actually pulled off very well. The shot of a young Matt Murdock crying over Jack Murdock's body in an empty alley with a bloody rose in his hand, I think was actually quite powerful, especially as their father-son relationship was quite well developed in this movie, so I do give Daredevil props for that, but overall it is a flawed opening act, there's no denying. In Batman v Superman there isn't so much origin, so it's kind of hard to compare. We do see some of Batman's parents getting shot, but it's brief because everybody knows about it already, so there's not really much point adding too much screen time for that. I think what really taints what little origin we get in this movie for me personally is that the death of the Wayne parents at the beginning of the movie ties directly into the now infamous Martha revelation that we see near the end of the movie, where Batman snaps out of a murderous rage upon realizing that the name of his mum is also the same as the name of Superman's adoptive Earth mum. It's illogical, and it's one of the things that I really struggle to excuse Batman v Superman for. Also, the imagery of a young Bruce Wayne getting carried up out of a hole by bats is really dumb. I don't care if it was a vision or a dream or whatever, it was terrible. Ultimately though, who is the better developed character? Well, I'd actually say that's a closer call than you might expect. I think Ben Affleck actually does quite a good job with both of these characters. I think he was successful at playing a hotshot lawyer in his younger years, just as he was successful at playing a cynical billionaire in his older years. In fact, if anything, I would say I probably empathise more with Matt Murdock because he does seem a little bit more human. He has more of a sense of humour, as we see through his interactions with Jon Favreau playing Foggy Nelson quite brilliantly, and then you also see him at an emotional low after the death of Elektra. In Batman v Superman, Bruce Wayne is just pissed off the entire time. And I get that the character of Bruce is supposed to be quite brooding, but he's also a socialite, and I feel like a socialite has to let their hair down and crack a smile, at least occasionally, and that's not something that really happens in Batman v Superman. In terms of their superhero alter egos, Ben Affleck makes quite a good Daredevil, and one of the first times that we see him when he's hunting a guy down and ultimately ends up pushing him in front of a train, he does look quite menacing, and you know, in this movie Daredevil does have an arc as well. He starts off as a murderous vigilante, he begins questioning himself whether he is just another one of the bad guys, and who can blame him? He does look kind of like a bad guy at some moments in this film, but then at the end he proves to himself that he is the hero of this story by choosing not to kill the Kingpin, aka the man responsible for the death of not just Matt Murdock's father, but also Elektra, possibly the love of Matt Murdock's life. So that's a very heroic gesture, to be strong enough to let the Kingpin live, and that's what proves that Matt Murdock is the hero of this story. Batman, I feel, has less of a character arc, and what arc he does have, I feel, doesn't so much benefit the character as it does the Warner Brothers film studio. Let me explain. In the movie, Batman starts off with a great mistrust of Superman that then turns into a great respect for Superman by the end of the movie, and an desire to honour Superman's legacy by uniting the Justice League. I just can't shake the feeling that comic book Batman, master of strategy, wouldn't have acted the way that Batman v Superman Batman did in the first place. Batman's actions in this movie seem less caused by Batman's mistrust of Superman and more caused by Warner Brothers' desire to see Batman and Superman fight, even if the script can't justify it, purely because it will mean they can use a catchy title for their big blockbuster movie. That being said, Batman is quite cool in the movie, he looks quite cool, he does cool things. He does kill a lot of people, which has upset some fans. I'm not a huge Batman fan, so I'm not super bothered by it, but I can totally understand why somebody would be bothered by it. Interestingly, what that does mean is that Daredevil is probably more faithful to the comics than Batman v Superman, which I find utterly bizarre but kind of brilliant. Ultimately, this is a really hard one to call. I think Ben Affleck's a good actor, and he did quite a good job with Matt Murdock and with Bruce Wayne. So, without sounding like a cop-out, I think I'm going to have to call this one a draw. Part 2. Villains. Interestingly, we don't see Kingpin or Bullseye until 45 minutes into the Daredevil's director's cut, and things don't get off to a great start. The rap music played over Kingpin's introduction wasn't great. It made it seem like Wilson Fisk was the tough boss of a record label more than he was a terrifying crime kingpin. However, to be fair, just seconds later, director Mark Steven Johnson quashes those notions by having Kingpin brutally murder 2 people for literally no reason. I have to give props to Michael Clarke Duncan for really selling the psychotic nature of the Kingpin in this moment. I still think this scene is perhaps a little bit heavy-handed, but it does show some commitment to portraying the Kingpin as the total nutjob that he is, and you know what, I would say Michael Clarke Duncan was pretty well cast overall. Physically, he's very intimidating, and I think he comes across as a believable, intelligent crime boss as well. I think maybe he could have used a little bit more development. He doesn't get that much screen time here, all things considered, but still, I think he was a good villain overall. But while I like Kingpin in this movie, I cannot defend Colin Farrell's Bullseye. My goodness, this performance was abysmal. It was extremely over the top. I think maybe Colin Farrell was trying to come across as scary, but instead he just came across as very annoying. Interestingly, some people have said the same thing about Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, but you cannot tell me, even if you hated Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, and I know some people did, you cannot tell me that he is more annoying than Colin Farrell as Bullseye. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. I'm putting my foot down. But anyway, let's talk about Lex in Batman v Superman. He is a character that has divided comic book fans. Some enjoy Jesse Eisenberg's interpretation, others really do not. I feel somewhere in the middle. I didn't hate what Jesse Eisenberg did with the character, nor did I love it. I think ultimately I would have preferred maybe a more traditional interpretation played by someone like Bryan Cranston. I think maybe this young, edgy version of Lex Luthor was a little bit unnecessary. That being said, you know, I didn't hate it, I'm just kind of indifferent towards it. I would say that I think in the Daredevil movie the villain's motivations are a little bit more clear-cut. Kingpin is just a crime boss trying to keep his crime empire together. Bullseye is a psychopath who has a grudge against Daredevil because Daredevil made him miss, which is something that Bullseye has never done before. I know that last motive is kind of stupid, but at least we understand it. Trying to understand Lex Luthor's motivations in Batman v Superman is a little more difficult. Presumably he's trying to kill Superman because he sees Superman as a threat, and also in the comic books he has this huge superiority complex, so that might also come into it. But the way he goes about trying to kill Superman is extremely convoluted, and you'd think that a man with Lex Luthor's resources could have thought of a more efficient way of doing it. Doomsday is the other big villain of Batman v Superman, but he's really not even worth talking about. He is pretty much just a mindless beast who comes in for the three heroes to fight. There's not really any personality there whatsoever. So, given that Batman v Superman had two villains that I'm kind of completely indifferent to, whereas Daredevil had one villain that I actually did quite like, I think I'm going to have to give the villain category to Daredevil. Part 3. Superheroines. Despite the fact she had very little screen time, I have to say that Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman was probably one of my favourite parts of Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice. I think her civilian appearances as Diana Prince were done well, and I think her big entry into the final battle sequence, accompanied by Hans Zimmer's awesome score, was pretty great. I'm smiling because I'm thinking about it, and it literally makes me happy. It's like one of the only great things from Batman v Superman was just that moment. Everybody loved it. I think everybody loved it. Yes, she may not have been particularly developed in Batman v Superman, but I think purely in terms of making people interested in this character again, Zack Snyder really succeeded. There's a lot of enthusiasm for Wonder Woman right now, and I think that we have to give him at least a little bit of credit for that. In the 2003 Daredevil movie, Elektra is stunningly miscast. I think that the root cause of why Elektra doesn't really hit the mark, both in the Daredevil movie and in her subsequent spin-off movie, is because Jennifer Garner just isn't an intimidating enough presence to pull off the character. In the Marvel comics, Elektra is one of the most deadliest people in the Marvel Universe. No one fucks with Elektra because they know that if they do, they're probably going to end up dead. So, I mean, it's not Jennifer Garner's fault that the script didn't really stay true to this idea, but I think even if it had, Jennifer Garner just wouldn't have been able to pull it off. That being said, I do have to say that I feel like Elektra wasn't quite as bad in the director's cut of Daredevil as I remember her being in the theatrical cut of Daredevil. I watched that a few years ago, maybe I was just in a bad mood, but Elektra was watchable in the director's cut. And you know, we do learn more about her than we do Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman. We learn about Elektra's family, we learn about her personality a little bit. But that is not me saying that Elektra was well done in the Daredevil movie. She was very miscast, her action scenes were terrible for the most part. So yeah, of course, Batman v Superman is going to win this one. Wonder Woman is awesome, Elektra, not so much. Part 4. Action sequences. Let's start off talking about the action scenes where a solo hero takes down a big group full of enemies all by themselves. When the third trailer for Batman v Superman dropped, all anyone could talk about was the Batman warehouse clear-out scene where Batman takes out about a dozen guys single-handedly, by breaking through the floor and making the most of the element of surprise. Now it has to be said this is quite a good action scene, it's well put together and shows off just how well trained a fighter Batman is. In Daredevil, the closest comparison is probably near the beginning of the movie, where Ben Affleck's Daredevil clears out a bar full of gang members single-handedly. This action sequence suffers from not being very clear or well lit. I do give the people behind the Daredevil movie props for experimenting visually with Daredevil's power set. However, in this instance it doesn't really pay off because it does make the fight very hard to follow. I do like the idea of Daredevil clearing his radar sense after a passing train just completely floods it, but that doesn't change the fact that this action sequence is very hard to follow, and the Batman warehouse clear-out scene is undeniably better. I feel like perhaps these days film studios can get away with more under the restrictions of a PG-13 or 12A rating, and I think maybe that's why the Daredevil fight lacked the clarity and brutality of Batman's big moment in Batman v Superman. Part 5. Climactic action. Both movies have two big action sequences at the end. The Batman-Superman fight, despite being the big battle that the movie is named after, isn't brilliant. It is quite illogical plot-wise that these two characters would be fighting. I can't get past the idea that if Superman had just explained himself a little better, the whole thing could have been avoided. Plus there's the whole Martha revelation, which we've already talked about, but it does get on my nerves to an insane degree. However, if you sit back and ignore these plot inconsistencies, I do think there's some entertainment value to be found here. Zack Snyder may not be a great director, but I do think he knows his way around an action scene, so, you know, it's a fairly enjoyable fight sequence if you can just ignore some of the stupid moments. The Daredevil vs Bullseye fight is far less enjoyable, and I put this down to far too much bullshit courtesy of Colin Farrell. The fight choreography is terrible, and the whole thing seems more concerned with squeezing in as many funny faces and funny noises by Colin Farrell as possible. Daredevil flipping around in slow motion while Bullseye throws shards of glass at him was just terrible, and the big CGI organ that falls apart looks horrendous. Batman v Superman wins. Where the Daredevil movie recovers some ground is in the big fight between Daredevil and the Kingpin. In the director's cut, this fight is extended, and I think the film really benefits from it. It's not a bad fight sequence, it feels very real, and I think this is because Michael Clarke Duncan plays his role far less cartoonishly than Colin Farrell played Bullseye. As a result, this fight does feel very real. It just feels like two guys putting an end to an incredibly personal conflict, and it works. It's a good fight, it feels very brutal, and I enjoyed watching it. The Trinity vs Doomsday fight was one which I enjoyed mostly for the inclusion of Wonder Woman. I feel like had Wonder Woman not joined the battle, my interest wouldn't be so strong. There is a heck of a lot of CGI, and at times the battle can be very hard to keep up with, and I think that's another reason why I like the Daredevil vs Kingpin fight so much. It's very small scale. There's very little CGI, there's no buildings being destroyed. There's two guys who have serious beef with each other, fighting in an office. That's it. It's refreshingly small scale, and the emotional stakes are far higher than in the Batman v Superman Doomsday fight. For that reason, I'm giving Daredevil a point. Part 6. Plot. The plot of the Daredevil director's cut is more coherent than the plot to Batman v Superman. I watched the making of the director's cut, a featurette called Giving the Devil His Due, and you can totally tell that Mark Steven Johnson was really bummed out about how much they cut for the theatrical release, because his additions really do make the plot better. It's a simpler story about a guy defending Hell's Kitchen against a guy who wants to rule it with a crime empire. Almost everything in the film feeds into the two of them eventually meeting each other and facing off, and it works. I think that Daredevil really benefits from coming from a time before cinematic universes were a thing. These days, everything is a rush to build a universe, but back then, in 2003, nobody wanted a cinematic universe, no one was even thinking of building one. And so as a result, Daredevil can just focus on making a coherent story rather than worrying on building up all these things for future movies. No, it doesn't have to worry about that. It can just focus on making this movie an okay movie, and that's what it is. It's an okay movie. Batman v Superman's plot in comparison is messy. We've already talked about how the very fact that Batman and Superman are fighting each other doesn't really make tons of sense, plus the shoehorned in appearances from the Justice League members and the many visions and flashbacks that the film has really does kind of derail the plot a little bit. As a result, I give Best Story to the Daredevil director's cut. The scores are tied, so we're going into the sudden death round. Daredevil's soundtrack really hasn't aged well. And this is coming from someone who used to be obsessed with Evanescence. These days I'm not as much of an Evanescence fan, but I do still think that they're not as bad as some people would have you believe. Anyway, the 2003 Daredevil movie doesn't have a particularly good score, and the soundtrack is full of nu metal bands, which is a little bit distracting. Nu metal was very popular in 2003, and so its inclusion in the Daredevil movie is just a reflection of the time it was made. But yes, undoubtedly Batman v Superman does have a better soundtrack. I quite like Hans Zimmer as a composer, and I do think that Batman v Superman score has a few memorable tracks. So yes, I would have to give best soundtrack to Batman v Superman. In terms of comic relief, Daredevil definitely wins out. Jon Favreau doesn't get a lot of credit, but he does give quite a likeable performance here. He has some genuinely funny lines, and it helps to elevate the tone here and there, and that's something that Batman v Superman never really tries to do. Now, I'm not saying that every film has to be hilariously funny. I know that's the argument that some Batman v Superman defenders have given, but I would say that in a comic book movie especially, a few light moments here and there go a long way. So for that reason, I'm giving Daredevil a point. In terms of costume design, I would say that Batman v Superman should definitely take a point. I think the Batman costume looks pretty cool. Superman costume is alright, although I probably would have preferred some brighter colours, but whatever. Wonder Woman, on the other hand, looks brilliant. The Daredevil costume is, to be fair, another product of its time. In 2003, superhero films were still new, still a bit of a gamble. Fox had had some success with the X-Men films, but they weren't sure if they were going to get the same success with Daredevil, and so, just to be safe, The Daredevil costume here is basically just a red version of the costumes worn in the 2000 X-Men film. Not very interesting to look at as a result. Bullseye's costume is essentially just like a leather trench coat which looks fucking terrible, and Elektra's costume also isn't super interesting either. So to conclude, the scores on the doors: 6 points to Batman v Superman, 5 points to Daredevil. That implies that Batman v Superman is a slightly better film, but it's actually a very close call. I would recommend that anyone who hasn't already should check out the Daredevil director's cut, because, you know, it's actually a solid film. It's not great, it's not like the best superhero film ever or anything like that, but it's alright. It's actually surprisingly solid, and I didn't hate watching it, which is more than I expected. Anyways, you can check out my full written review of Batman v Superman. There'll be a link in the video description, which I'm sure people will go to in droves. You can also subscribe to my channel if you so desire, and if you're feeling really wild, you can like the video. You can click here for my Star Wars The Force Awakens review. You can click here for my Deadpool video review. I also made a video about a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago, about how I thought Batman v Superman was probably going to be terrible. That was a month before the film came out, so perhaps my psychic powers are finally coming through. I've been waiting for them for ages, so let's hope so, hey? I wondered if the Daredevil Elektra playground fight was going to be as bad as I remember it. I thought surely it couldn't, but indeed it was. That is just a terrible, terrible sequence. I don't know who thought it was a good idea. The weird thing about it is the tonal shift. About 10 minutes prior, Daredevil literally let a man be disembodied by a train, and then like 10 minutes later we're watching a scene which looks like it was a reject from one of the Spy Kids films. It's just such a weird sequence. Got all the little kids like cheering them on, and they're fighting in the seesaw. It's super cheesy. I have no idea who thought that was a good idea. The Daredevil movie has a worse training montage than Batman v Superman. The Batman training montage in BVS isn't great, but the Elektra training montage in Daredevil is quite bad. The weirdest thing about it is that we see this Elektra training montage. It looks like Elektra means business, you know, she's gonna hunt down her dad's killer, it's gonna be great. And then literally in the very next scene, she's killed. I mean, I know Elektra gets killed by Bullseye in the comics, but in this film it just kind of comes out of nowhere, seems very premature. Maybe it was just an excuse to have more Evanescence songs in the film. She does train to Bring Me to Life by Evanescence. If I was a superhero, I'd probably train to Bring Me to Life by Evanescence, because it's a great song. Elektra trains while listening to Evanescence, and I have to respect that. I think I'd probably do the same if I was a superhero. Evanescence have some alright songs. I don't know. Like I said, I don't really like Evanescence that much anymore, but I went through a phase, man. I went through a phase where I was Evanescence fan #1.